Daniel and family are up in New York. I think it's in Elmira, where they are, just north of the Pennsylvania border, but I hope they're having a good trip. So I'm filling in for Daniel tonight. We'll be kicking off in Mark chapter 6 tonight to continue our study of the gospel according to Mark. Daniel's been showing this slide just to get across the point that we've got a patchwork quilt that we're putting together with all the different themes and the topics and the threads that go through the Gospel of Mark. And at the end of it, we'll have this beautiful picture called the Gospel of Mark. And so we're going to start off, since we're about a third of the way through, we're going to do a little bit of review through the first 5 chapters, and then pick up in chapter 6 today. So Daniel told me to do this, that I had to have a test. So I'm sorry, but here we go. So we're going to have 4 fill-in-the-blank questions, and the answers are on the right. He didn't say how hard the test had to be, okay? Let's see if we can fill in the blanks. So chapter 1, Jesus announces his kingdom of healing and freedom. That's it. Healing and freedom. And then chapter 2, this is open book because the answers are right here, okay? So, chapter 2 and 3, people object to Jesus' mission to make somebody whole. Sinners, okay. That one. And chapter 4, Jesus' kingdom is for those with hearing ears and what kind of hearts? Humble, okay. And the last one, chapter 5, Jesus overpowers nature, demons, sickness, and death. Okay, we got them all. So Daniel, if you're listening, I'm looking at the curve. We're grading on a curve tonight, and it says that everybody flunked. Oh, wait. It's upside down. Everybody passed. We did great tonight, so thanks, everyone. We did a good job. So we're going to keep going with a little bit of a geographical overview just to kind of set the stage for where we've been. So Jesus has been active in his Galilean ministry. So this map kind of gives you the overview of where he has been. And so we start off in Mark. He's in that upper circle, the upper red circle, at the top of the Sea of Galilee, around Capernaum, Bethsaida, those kind of areas there. And then in chapter 5, he makes his way down to the area just north of Gadara called the Gadarenes, which is the lower part of the lake. And then we're going to watch where he goes after this as we get into chapter 6. So just a little bit of geographical overview here. The lake itself, or the Sea of Galilee, is about 12 and a half miles long, top to bottom, and at its widest point, 8 miles wide. And so in Texas, we would call that just a large cattle watering hole, but actually it's a pretty good-sized body of water in an arid climate. It's very important to the region. And just wanted to put this up here. We're going to show some other pictures later, but when they say they go across the lake, just realize that they're talking somewhere between 4 to 8 to 12 and a half miles, that they had to be either rowing a boat or relying on wind power or something to get there. And then, as we have read in some of these chapters before, some people didn't have access to a boat, so they had to run to catch up to Jesus. And so if you're running all the way around the lake, it's a 32-mile jaunt, so a little bit more than a marathon. But just imagine that if you're over in Bethsaida, Capernaum, and Jesus is going over on the eastern side to get to Gennesaret, and you're on foot, you're probably hoofing it 6 to 8 miles. It's not an insignificant amount. Now, they're used to it, but for me, I'd be winded after one. And just put it into context that the people back then were really dedicated and really wanted to see Jesus, and they were putting in the effort to go see him. So that's the overview from a geographical point of view. Here's a couple of pictures just to let you know what it looked like in the area. I believe this is on the northern side. Now, some of y'all have been there, so feel free to comment. Steve, have you been to this part? Not, okay. Anyone been to the sea? Okay, Mike, is this north side? It looks like the north side to me. Okay. Looks kind of nice. Pleasant place. And I like this picture, even though a little bit dark, but you can see the clouds rolling in, and the Sea of Galilee, as we've talked before. And Steve, I think you talked about this before in one of your recent sermons. Due to the geography there in the mountains just to the east, you can get cold mountain air meeting up with warm, moist air off the Mediterranean, and all of a sudden you get storms coming in. So you can see the clouds forming here, and you can get some pretty rough water, which we'll look at a little bit later. This one is didn't come across really well. It's in black and white, and the reason I wanted to pick this one is the first 2 shots looked across that 8-mile width. This is the one looking lengthwise, and so if you look really close, there's mountains in the very far end, but that's south looking to north and what it would look like. So when Jesus says, hey guys, let's go across the lake, That's what you're looking at. You're, 8 miles across and 12 up and down. So there's a little bit of effort when you get in your boat. They're used to it. They're fishermen, but again, I'd be hoofing it either around it or rowing a boat after about 5 minutes. That's me. Okay, more overview, I guess, through the first 5 chapters. I thought we'd spend some time just overviewing a few things. So first of all, what have we learned in the first 5 chapters about Jesus' traits? What do we see in the Gospel of Mark particularly that stands out to you about Jesus and how he acts and how he behaves and some of the traits that we pick up about him? Just anything top of mind in the first 5 chapters. A teacher, for sure. He's a teacher. Sees people's hearts. That's a good one. Compassionate. I like that one. Really good one. Do you have one, Seal? Patience with the people. That's another good one. Anyone else? Right. He knew the plan, right? That's right. Mark? Yes. So he was busy about all of that as well, right? Okay. Any others, Brian? Yeah, definitely did that. Definitely did that. Okay, so that's some of the things that we've seen in the first 5 chapters. I put a few others up here. Wanted to highlight that in the first 5 chapters, we absolutely know he was accepted by the Father. At his baptism, we hear, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." So we know he's accepted by the Father. He has a knowledge of Scripture. People understand it. They acknowledge his knowledge and wisdom with the Word, which is important, and his adherence to Scripture. We mentioned compassion. Patience has come up already. Service, this idea of service to whoever's around him, whether it's healing or feeding or things like that. He's got a mindset of service. Very active prayer life. How many times have we read already that he has sought to get away from the crowd so he could have alone time to pray? And we're going to see that again in chapter 6. A dedicated teacher. I think this one is the one that stands out a whole lot. And whether he was teaching by parables or taking his apostles aside to teach them privately, he was active in teaching, and the people noticed that he did it with what? Authority. And that was confusing to them, and we'll read about that tonight, is how did he get that knowledge? Where did it come from? But we've already seen that he's teaching with authority. And finally, we saw the one case where he exhibited righteous anger. Do you remember what the case was? Think back to when he healed someone on the Sabbath, and he was getting chided by the scribes and Pharisees for doing a good work on the Sabbath. And so his anger, it recorded that he was angry at their lack, or their hardened hearts, basically. He was angry about that. So those are some of the things that we've learned about Jesus in the first 5 chapters, and we'll see that continue as we get into chapter 6. Now, the next one's a little bit of an eye chart, but I thought it might be fun also to summarize some of the audience reactions that we've seen to Jesus so far. So we've got several groups up there: scribes, Pharisees, the crowds, the multitudes themselves. The demons are kind of a class that he's come across. The apostles themselves, and then his own people, whether it's his family or the area right around Nazareth. So when you think back to how the scribes and Pharisees are reacting to what they're seeing in Jesus, what comes to mind? Positive or negative? Hostility. Okay, I'm going to take that as negative too. So, yeah, exactly. What are some of the phrases that you can recall from the first 5 chapters? Anything? Oh yeah, he eats with sinners. There's one for sure. Yes, that's right. So we have several of them. We'll just kind of scan through these quickly. But look at these. He speaks blasphemies. He eats and drinks with sinners. Why don't your disciples fast? Why do you break the Sabbath? He cast out demons by Beelzebub. And finally, at the end of that chapter, I think it's 4, it says they plotted to destroy him. So that's the uptake from the scribes and Pharisees. Not very good overall. There's some exceptions to this, but in the general rule, he was not received well by the scribes and Pharisees. And they weren't exactly what they were looking for, or Jesus wasn't what they were looking for. But we'll see more of that as we get through the book, obviously. So how are the crowds reacting to Jesus? The multitudes. Okay, more positive, right? And so we see some things coming out from the crowds. I'm sorry, Brian, did you have another?
I just said they were attracted.
Yes, definitely attracted to them. So some things we see from them. Their observation of Jesus made them astonished. They were amazed. They feared. They glorified God. They brought their sick. They believed he could heal. They spread the word when they were healed. And then in the one case where in the last week he raised Jairus' daughter, they ridiculed him at first. And then what happened? When he raised her from the dead, there was great amazement. So it's a pretty interesting response there. But that's how the crowds are reacting to them. By and large, it's very positive, very accepting of who he is and what he can do. And I love those words, amazed and astonished. That's just painting a picture of how they responded to him. How have the demons responded to Jesus so far? Respected him. Yep. Anything else? Absolutely. So they keep saying, you are the Son of God, which is really interesting. So who had belief in Jesus, probably more so than anyone else at this point? The demons did, because they knew who he was, and they knew what he could do and would do to them. Don't send me into torment yet. Let me go into this herd of swine, that kind of thing. You are the Son of God, and they were obedient. They did what Jesus commanded them to do. So, yes, absolutely. They should have been, right, Harrison? That's right. Okay, the apostles, just real quick. So initially they were obedient. Remember, when Jesus would call, they would obey and they would follow, which was interesting. There was a desire to understand. Remember when he's teaching in parables that they didn't quite get it, and he would take them aside and explain the parables. So there was a desire to understand. However, going along with this, what else have we seen out of the apostles? That last bullet. They are fearful of what he can do, especially when he calmed the seas and the waves. Remember that? Who is this guy that he can do that? But they're also exhibiting a lack of faith from time to time that we've seen already so far, and we're going to see again in chapter 6. So kind of interesting that all this is being seen by his chosen apostles, that even after seeing all these things, there's still a lack of faith. And finally, his own people from Nazareth, the town where he came from, whether it's his family or the people around him. The first thing that we read about those people, he said, he's out of his mind. So here you've got people being amazed at his knowledge, amazed at his wisdom of the word and his ability to heal. And yet people are saying from Nazareth, he's out of his mind. I mean, that's a really weird conclusion after all of these great things that have been shown. And we do have record that his family sought him to be around him, whether they thought they needed to help him or they wanted to be with him. Not sure. It just says that they sought him. And of course, he said, you're my family. Okay. So instead of peeling off and going with his mother, brothers, sisters, he says, I'm going to be with you. So that's kind of the round table view of how he's being received through the first 5 chapters. Really interesting to see in, kind of this quilt work that we're putting together, the variety of responses that he's getting from the crowds, up to and including demons, that fear him and know who he is and are obedient to him. So any other thoughts about how Jesus is being received so far? Okay. So just to get us up to speed, last week we talked about Mark 5, and so just several things that happened. So while they were crossing from the north to the south, that's that long dimension that we were looking at. While crossing the sea, Jesus calms the wind and the waves on the way there. They land at the country of the Gadarenes at the south part of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus heals the demon, who's known as Legion, because there's a whole bunch of them. And the possessed man is healed. The people ask him to leave. They are fearful at this point, and so they cross the sea again. And then at the more northern part of the Sea of Galilee, he is healing people. You have the woman that comes up behind him and touches him and heals the issue of blood that she has. And finally, Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. The last phrase we have in chapter 5 is, and they were overcome with great amazement. So that's the state of the audience right there at the end of chapter 5. People are amazed at what Jesus has been able to do. So that brings us right into chapter 6. So where we're going to be in the map today, we're going to pick up where you see the 1. He's going to be out to the southwest of where Nazareth is. If you can see that, I should be pointing this way. You don't know where I'm pointing, right? So he's picking up on, it's perfectly obvious to me where I'm pointing, but he's going to be here in Nazareth to begin with. And then from that point on, it says he taught in a circuit. So he went around the lake and ends up in this more northeastern part of the lake. And at the very end, they cross the lake back over and end up at Gennesaret over here on the western side of the lake. So that's geographically what's going on around the Sea of Galilee at that time. So as Daniel has been doing, let's just take a few moments to describe how we are looking at the chapter. And I'm going to assume that everyone's had a chance to read the chapter and do a little bit of diving into it. And we'll do some more tonight, obviously. But as you're looking at the chapter, how did you see the key episodes playing out? What things stood out to you kind of in order? What's the first thing that happened? Right. So he's in Nazareth, and they kind of feel blah, right? Right. So we'll come back to that and talk about some of the key things that we're seeing. But yes, that's the first one. He's rejected in his home city, which is really interesting because they knew him. And as we'll see, they acknowledged his works and his teaching, but they still rejected him, which is really interesting. And after that, what do we see happening? What was that, Albert? Sends the 12 out. Okay, so he's going to send them out to preach and to heal, it says there in those verses in chapter 6. Then after that, what do we see happening? King Herod? Right. Uh-oh. There we go. We have this story about Herod beheading John the Baptist. We're going to talk about each one of these a little bit before we go into the rest of the class, but we're going to get the outline done first. After this one, what do we see? Right, the 12 come back, and he ends up feeding a bunch of people, right? So interesting. They come back and they want to debrief. They want to download. They want to tell them everything that happened. They're pretty excited, or at least it sounds that way to me. They were pretty excited, and so instead of being able to get away, they have to end up teaching a large multitude and ends up feeding them as well. And then after that, yep, they're going across the sea again. So this is probably east to west, and so Jesus ends up walking on the sea to meet them. It says in the middle of the sea, and have them coming in there and then calming the sea at that time. And last but not least, what's the last thing we read about? Yeah, so they're in Gennesaret at that time, and he is healing. Basically, everyone that is able to get to him and touch him is being healed. We're pretty large-scale miracle going on here. So that's the outline of Mark 6. So rejection in Nazareth, the 12 sent to preach, the history of what happened with John the Baptist and how and why he was beheaded. Jesus fed the multitude, and it records about how many people were there? 5,000 men. So it's a lot of people. Steve, you did the math on that during that class. So how many was that? It was a lot of people. Yeah, so it could have been 15 to 20,000, right? Yeah, it's a lot of people. And then we have him walking on the sea, catching up to the disciples, and then the healing in Gennesaret. So let's look real quick at some of the key points that we want to take away from this. So we'll just hit the highlights, but some things that stood out to us as we're going through this. So Jesus being rejected in Nazareth. Wow. I mean, this is a big deal. He's on his home court. People are acknowledging him, and yet they are still rejecting him. What stood out to you in the passage about some of the things that were said and done while he was there? That's Jesus' assessment, right? A prophet is not without honor in his own country. Yeah. What else? Yeah. He just marvels. He's astonished, right? So Jesus is amazed that they are basically rejecting him after everything that's been said and done. So that happened as well. Anything else? Right. which is interesting. I'm just going to pop these up there. So people were astonished, which was, to me, the interesting thing. There was a recognition of what he was teaching and what he was able to do, because it mentions roundabout way his knowledge, but specifically his wisdom and his healing. So they had recognized that, but they were offended. What offended them more than anything else, according to those verses? Yeah, we know this guy. Yeah, we know his, right, right. Mother, brothers, and sisters were all listed there. We know this guy. He was the son of the carpenter. Remember that? And yet, he's doing all this stuff, and they add all that together and say, we're going to reject him. I'm just astounded at that, you know? Jealous? That could be. Could be. Is that what you were getting at, Shannon, when you were talking about him being astonished?
The same way when we think, oh, I'm so excited about whatever I learned in the Bible, and you want to share it with someone that's close to you, and they don't listen to you or whatever. So it shows that.
Same kind of thing, right? So you can be rejected for all the wrong reasons. Albert?
Per se is happening. I don't put words or add words to what's not there, but it's just the question of where did this man get these things really makes me think about their mindset that something, this isn't just a well-educated person, that something has been imparted to him possibly, and if I'm implying too much, then it's just something that struck me.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Anyone else? Okay, so that's kind of a synopsis of what happens there. So they recognize what he's doing, but they reject him because they can't get over the fact that he's from among them. As Shannon said, he marvels because of their unbelief. And it says he could not do any mighty works, but he did heal a few people. So even in the midst of all that, they ended up rejecting. So at the end of all this, it's obvious that he's got to move on. They're not going to listen. So I'm drawing the contrast of where he's been and what we'll see later in chapter 6, that people are thronging him, bringing the sick to him because they know they're going to be healed. But that's not happening here. So they had an opportunity, but they let it go by, which is kind of interesting as well. So after this, it says he does a circuit and touches on the cities and villages on the way. And this is where we end up on the map on the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee. So at this point, we hit item number 2, where Jesus sends out the 12 to preach and teach. So what stood out to you in this particular passage? Anything in particular?
Just take off your feet and just leave.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Teaching.
Yeah, if you're not accepted, shake the dust off your feet, and it would be better for Sodom and Gomorrah than that particular town. Okay, what else? Yes.
They didn't bring extra money. They didn't bring an extra cloak. They didn't. I guess they were going to be provided along the way.
Exactly. So don't pack anything. Don't just take your sandals, and don't worry about money, and don't take an extra coat. Y'all hit it. So what are they going to learn from this, by the way? Yeah, that he, Jesus, could do anything. And what was that? Trust in God. Have faith, right? That God, Jesus is going to provide. So send them out 2 by 2, which shows some wisdom. I think it's always easier for us to draw strength one from another when we're together. So I kind of like that. The power to heal, the power to throw out demons was given to them. Don't take anything. Stay in the place where you enter. And if you're not received, just shake the dust off your feet. And so it says specifically the apostles preached repentance. Okay, so if anyone had been listening to John the Baptist before, this should be a familiar message, right? Repentance. But this was a different message now because now the kingdom is almost here. So a little bit different take on it. So they were preaching repentance, healing, and casting out demons as they were going about. Okay. Any other thoughts, comments about these? Oh, go ahead, Brian.
I would just say we sort of see a spiritual principle that exists to this very day and will continue, but those who believed, I'm talking about the mission of sending out the disciples, those who believed and accepted disciples, God in the form of the disciples abided with them. Those who rejected the disciples were rejected by God and they departed. And we see that now, that those who don't believe and turn their backs on God do not have God.
Right, exactly. Okay, so the apostles are dispersed, and next we hear about King Herod. What is Herod's concern? When he hears about Jesus and everything he's doing, what's his concern? Yep, I done a bad thing. I beheaded John the Baptist. Later on, does he know that he shouldn't have? Does he know John was innocent? What was that, Robert? Right, exactly.
He would do it.
Right. So, exactly. So all this stuff happens here. So Herod's convinced that John's come back because he knew that John was a righteous man. The other people thought that Jesus was, says three things: Elijah, the prophet, or like a prophet. And so we know who Elijah would have been, why they would have thought that, but hey, you missed it. That was John the Baptist. He came in the likeness of Elijah. The prophet, they were actually right. Was Jesus the prophet? And by that, I'm going back to Deuteronomy 18, where Moses says, there will come a prophet like me. When he comes, hear him. So in that sense, they got that one right, but they didn't do enough with that knowledge. And the last one was like a prophet. But Herod is convinced that it's John the Baptist come back to life. So we all know the sordid story. He's married to Herodias, who is his brother Philip's ex-wife, I guess, or wife, legally his wife, spiritually his wife, but John says you don't have a right to be married. Herod hadn't done anything, but who spurred him up to do something? Herodias, nice lady. I just picture her as a grandma type. No, I'm kidding. She is a vicious woman. And so he's in prison, and along comes this feast, and we remember what happens. Herodias' daughter comes in, does the dance. The men are, I guess, impressed. I'll just use that word. And then Herod makes a very rash promise. I'll give you whatever you want up to the half of my kingdom. Uh-oh. So she doesn't know what to do. I'm going to go ask Mom. Herodias says, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter. I mean, how vicious do you have to be that you're not happy till your enemy's head is served to you on a platter? Wow. That's really bad. Really bad. What was that? Turkey on Thanksgiving? I hadn't actually drawn that analogy, but okay, we'll run with that one. Okay. And Herod knows he's done a bad thing because he wasn't going to do anything to harm John until all this happened with Herodias and her request. Right. So I did throw in a quick question here. So based on what we see from Herod and Herodias, any parallel behaviors that we can see from Old or New Testament? Can we think of anyone that didn't have the moral fortitude to stand up and keep a righteous man from being killed? Other than Herod. What was that? Pilate, absolutely. Can we think of anyone that shot off his mouth, made a rash vow, and ended up having to have an innocent person killed? Jephthah. I'm thinking of Jephthah and his daughter. He made the rash vow and ends up costing the life of his daughter. Can we think of any female characters that have this level of vindictiveness that they're willing to do anything to get their enemy slain? Oh, you guys didn't hesitate on that one. Yeah, Jezebel. That's exactly who I was thinking too. Yes, that's another one. That's another one. So we've seen this character trait before in other Bible incidences, but it's concentrated in this family to a large degree. Really sad situation. So that one kind of goes by as kind of like a parenthetical insert here in the flow of what's going on here. But that's what's going on with Herod. He's scared to death that John's come back at this particular time. So at this time, we get to the next point where Jesus feeds the multitude. So to set up this series of verses, the apostles are back. Again, they want to talk with Jesus about everything that's gone on. It's a good thing. He says, let's go away. You guys are tired. Need to get some rest. Let's find a quiet place. Well, how does that work out? Yeah, the multitude is going to find him. So a lot happens here, and I think this is a very familiar story to us, so we won't go too much into this, but we know that one of to me, the key phrases is here in the middle of this, when Jesus looks out on the multitude, what's his thought? Passion. And that just resonates with me. He felt for these people, and he looked out and said, these are like sheep without shepherd. And he took the time, regardless of how tired everyone was and where they'd been, he took the time to teach them, which just really stands out to me loud and clear. So it got time to eat late in the day. They've only got a little food. They can't go into the city to buy more. The apostles just totally misunderstand Jesus. And finally he says, bring me the food. And he blesses it. They divide everyone up. And what happens? How many people are full at the end of the day? What's that? Yeah. It says, everyone eats and is filled, which is pretty amazing to me. So from 5 loaves, 2 fishes, this multi-thousand-headed group is completely fed with plenty left over at the end because they gathered everything up, and I think they had 12 baskets at the end. So it records about 5,000 men, but as Steve pointed out, by the time you add wives, children, it could be a lot more than that. But it was a large crowd, all fed miraculously this way. So let's move on real quick. Before we get to the next one, I wanted to remind everyone how nice the Sea of Galilee can look. I mean, I think that's a really pretty picture. And on a calm day, I think I'd want to be on that lake. And then you see these bozos that say, hey, I wonder what it was like in a small boat when the Sea of Galilee was raging. And so you get someone with a replica of an old boat out in the middle of the sea in rough waters. That's what it looks like. And so we talked about the geography of the land with the mountains on the east. Cold air comes down, stirs up the water. It's a shallow lake. And I read someplace that's like Lake Erie up in the northeast. It's because it's shallow. When the wind comes across, it really stirs up a lot of waves. And that's exactly what's happening here. So file that away because we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So Jesus walks on the sea to his disciples. It says there that he wants them to go across the sea in the boat ahead of him. And they do that. So they're going across the boat. Where does Jesus go? What was that? To the mountain to pray. He sends the multitude away, and he gets some personal quiet time, which also stands out to me loud and clear. He needed that time. And so it says when he was coming down from the mountain, who does he see out in the middle of the lake? The apostles in the boat. And it says that they were struggling. They're having to row because the wind's working against them, not for them. So here they are out in the middle of the night. And it goes on to say that in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus walks on the water to get to them. Now, Steve, I'm going to pick on you again because you talked about this 4th watch. So what time of the night was that? Yeah, so it's the last watch. This is Roman time. They divided the night into 4s. And so this is the watch before dawn. So it's the latest watch. And so how long have these guys been working? Basically all night. So these guys are tired. And here comes Jesus walking on the water. Now go back to that picture. He's walking on that kind of water, something like that. Okay, so it says the wind was working against them. You can see what the wind does to the water. So he's out there working on this, or walking on this. They're amazed. They think he's a ghost or a spirit, and they're kind of afraid of all that. Jesus calms them down. Not only does he calm the apostles down, what else does he calm down? The sea again, because it gets calm. Okay. The apostles are, again, greatly amazed. They've seen him do this before, once already, where he calmed the seas and the wind. So he's seen him do it before. They just saw him feed 5,000 people. They have seen him heal over and over and over again, and yet they are amazed at what he's able to do here. And it says that their hearts were still hardened. So it's this lack of faith that we see. So that wraps up that particular story. And to wrap up the chapter, he goes on from where they landed to Gennesaret. It said they set anchor there. The people recognize him, and again, from far and wide throughout the region, people are bringing their sick. They know what Jesus can do with the sick, which is just amazing to me. They recognize it, and it says, as you close out the chapter, as many as touched him were healed. Okay, so the failure rate for Jesus healing people was what? 0. And Steve, you're in quality control, you know all about it. So that's 99.999. That's a lot. Like, it's amazing. So that kind of wraps up the key points, the flow of the chapter, and how that pieces in with everything else. So any other thoughts before we move on here? Because we're going to take a few minutes. Go ahead, Brian.
I couldn't find it in the scriptures, but Jesus told them to cross the lake, and best I can tell, they were heading out from Bethesda, which is the north, which would suggest to me they're heading to the southern point, but obviously they end up at Gennesaret, which is west. So I don't know if it's very important or not, but did they take a detour to Gennesaret?
It could be. I was looking for that same information, Brian. It's funny you bring that up. And the best I could come up with on that map was they were somewhere towards Capernaum to the east of that, and they were trying to get, he says specifically, go to Bethsaida, if I said that right. And so they're trying to get there, but they end up in Gennesaret. So maybe it was a function of the wind or whatever, but that's the best I could find. Okay, take a few moments to say, or to determine what you can see as the stitches, as Daniel's calling those threads between these different stories. What stands out to you as far as things that are repeated, things that catch your attention multiple times? What is linking these stories together as you go through this? And since we're short on time, we're just going to call it out. What's that? Multitudes, yes. Multiple multitudes, right? Okay. Teaching. Healing. Yes. Anything else weaving through that? Sorry? A lot of sailing going on, yes. So they're crossing the boat. Can you imagine how ripped those guys must be after all that rowing? I mean, these guys have got to be in good shape after all this. Well, some things that came to mind over and over, we read about Jesus' compassion, whether it was healing, feeding the multitude, his willingness to teach, even though they were all tired, he took time to teach, and the way he led and set an example for his apostles. We see that over and over in chapter 6. That's something that was recurring to me. The miracles, we talked about that, multiple ones, just like the chapter before. In this case, though, it was the feeding, again, the healings, and the calming of the sea. The crowds, we talked about that. That is a continuing theme. Twice in the chapter 6, we read about it's time to move on. Okay, Nazareth was one of those where they rejected him. He said, we're going to go on. And the other one was where he tells his 12 apostles, if they don't accept you, shake the dust off your feet and move on. So I thought that was interesting that twice Jesus recognized it was time to move on, and whether it's him personally or what the apostles were doing. Repeated lack of faith by the apostles. They don't know how they're going to feed the multitude. They haven't figured it out yet. Okay, so that was a test. And Jesus on the water. That was another one where they showed lack of faith. And then another recurring theme to me was a seeking of quiet time and prayer. And Jesus shows this multiple times. He even tries to get his apostles over to a quiet place, which I thought was interesting. So, any others that popped to mind? Yeah, Brian?
Again, I see a parallel of, for example, in Nazareth, the people did not believe. And there was little healing. And I see that parallel, or the stitch, if you will, to Jesus instructing his disciples to move on if they're not received. And I just see, again, that pattern of spiritual principle at present. If we choose God, God chooses us.
Right.
And abides with us, and we have the blessings of God.
Yep.
Otherwise not.
Mm-hmm. Any others? Okay, two quick things. So, in Daniel's outline, we always end up with this, but what did we learn about Jesus and what did we learn about us following Jesus from this particular chapter? We've already talked about some of Jesus' character traits, so I'm going to pop them up here, but I'm taken with his compassion and the extent of his compassion and the lengths that he will go to serve others, whether it's teaching or healing or feeding, whatever. That compassion is running through everything that he's doing. I am struck also by his leading by example, something we can all learn from, and the value that he places on quiet time and prayer, being by himself to talk to his Father. And so he had a relationship that we cannot know because he's the Son of God, and yet he thought it was important to be a way to talk with God personally and to do it in a quiet place. And we talked about this before. His patience is showing again. He marvels at people. He understands that people are lacking in faith, and yet he keeps that in. So he's got patience. What about us? What does this translate to us? How does this translate to us? What would you take away? Something that we need to work on based on what we read here. Albert?
Tonight was the last part of 11. Assuredly, I say to you, it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment. So I need to step up when I say, hey, do you know about God? Do you know, they've been sent out, and he's telling them up front, do your best, but if they don't listen, they would have known Sodom and Gomorrah. There would have been a sense of urgency, and I think of Jonah and Nineveh, repent and change, and the sense of urgency to give this message. I personally am reflecting, and I'm too soft and letting folks know about my Savior, and not necessarily getting my card punched, but being relaxed of not dusting my feet off, but also just moving on. When I think about it'll be worse on those, do I have that sense of urgency when I'm talking to others about Christ and God?
That's really good, Albert. That's something I know I can learn more from, is how urgent are we in teaching others, understanding what's on the other side of someone saying no to the gospel. It's dire straits. Go ahead, Harrison. Yeah, Harrison, if you couldn't hear him, said we need to spend more time in our prayer relationship with God. And I totally agree with that. I think I've actually got that up there. So I'm going to echo what we saw in Jesus. We need to have compassion and a willingness to serve. We need to be diligent in our teaching. We need to lead. We need to know when to move on. That's not the same thing as giving up, but it does mean to move on. Okay, and we can spend a lot of time talking about that, but at some point we had to move on for the time being. And then we had to find time to be alone to pray, like Harrison was saying. So, in summary, Daniel's been giving us a quick snippet. So what I'm going to tell you is I'm not going to tread on Daniel's space because he's going to give you his snippet next week. But I'll give you mine for tonight. In Mark 6, we see Jesus continually showing his compassion and willingness to teach. And that's what I'm kind of taking away. That word compassion is kind of locked in here based on everything that we're seeing in chapter 6. So Daniel will correct mine next week, and you'll get the accurate one that will be on the test. That won't be, but Daniel's will be when he gets back. And last but not least, as I'm reading through this book of Mark and we're going through the study, I am so impressed with what John wrapped up his gospel with, where he says, these events and miracles are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. This gospel is doing that for us and helping us build our faith and knowing how we can serve Jesus and be a true follower, a true Christian in going forward with him. Last thing, next week, I'll be picking up in Mark chapter 7, so read chapter 7 and 8, and Daniel should be back by then, Lord willing. Thank you all for the comments. Really appreciate it.